Let's have a look at sequential mediation experiment. This is just another type of an experiment which exists for us as researchers. And the distinction between this type of experiment and all other experiments is very clear. It is all about you having a mediator in your model that causes another mediator. So for you to best remember it, I have a set of domino here, and I want you to think about sequential mediation as a domino effect. When you trigger something, something else is happening. There a bit of reaction that is going on. So let me show you what it's all about. A bit of a disclaimer before I go into sequential mediation in a bit more detail. I'll be using a few academic papers as examples of the sequential mediation for you. I'm not promoting these journals or papers. I'm just using them to show you when sequential mediation design can be suitable for us as researchers when we run experiments. And it basically comes from my wider readership of the literature in marketing area. Before I show you what a sequential mediation is, a bit of a refresher. In a separate video which is dedicated to mediators, I explained that mediator is the underlying thought process, the underlying feelings, the underlying cognitive information processing that exists between your independent variable and your dependent variable, whatever you're measuring. And here on the screen, I have behavior just as an example of a dependent variable. Your dependent variable could be attitudes, could be perceptions, it could be knowledge, it could be anything else that you're measuring, even emotions, if you are investigating this aspect. So try to think of a mediator as something which is in between your independent variable and dependent variable. And this is exactly what is going through individuals' or consumers' minds as they are exposed to your advertisement. This is underlying thought process. It's the underlying explanation of the effect of the stimuli on the dependent variable. Again, if you're not sure after my explanation what mediator is, and you also want to know what a moderator is, you can have a look at the seminal work by Barron and Kenny from 1986, as it explains the moderator-mediator variable in more detail. Keep this visualization, this schematic in mind, and here comes the sequential mediation experiment. This is how it visually looks like. In this case, we have our independent variables, which have three types of interventions: two with the actual manipulations that we are doing, and a control group, which doesn't have an intervention. And here, as a researcher, we are saying when consumers are exposed to X, Y, and Z, this is what it will trigger. And this something, which is your mediator 1, will trigger mediator 2, which will then cause the dependent variable variations, the outcome in what you are researching. So sequential mediation is an experiment where one mediator is a trigger, or it causes, or it relates to the next mediator. So as the name suggests, there is a sequence. You have your first mediator occurring, and then the second mediator occurring. Now, you may have already guessed that these type of experiments are more complex. They would require more readership in the literature because they tap into more complex information processing, and not all consumer behavior may actually have such a thought process. These type of experiments are very unique because they need to have a very strong theoretical foundation to say this is really the first thing that needs to occur, and then the second one that needs to occur. How do we do it statistically? Let me show you an example. This comes from the Journal of Marketing, a paper published in 2019 by Kamleitner, Thürridl, and Martin, and I did hope I pronounced the last name correctly. The aspect that this research team was investigating was the upcycle products and how you can stimulate consumers' purchases of these type of products. And they had two interventions. One where they've highlighted or they made salient the product's biographical story. They explain its past identity, that it used to be an airbag, so it has a different identity in the past. And in their second condition, there was no story. It was basically a description of the product. And the author team conceptualized that the first mediator would be the product story perception. The product biographical story should create better or higher or more vivid product story perceptions And then that should actually trigger the feeling of specialness in consumers, which would then impact on their purchase intentions. So in this case, you can see that it did make sense to have sequential mediation because consumers who are exposed to one of the stimuli may actually first form product perceptions. And this is very intrinsic to marketing discipline. A lot of studies, a lot of phenomena that we investigate, they actually look at product perceptions that consumers form when they're exposed to a particular advertisement or stimuli. But in this case, the author team said, well, that's not enough. It's the feeling of specialness that will actually occur from the first mediator that would then impact the purchase intentions. How do you actually analyze such models? Statistically, if you're not familiar with this, you can use model 6 from Process Hayes, which is a build on from a SPSS, or you can use Smart PLS if you have a moderator anywhere here. If you're not sure what a moderator is, please watch my video on the moderator. It is available on this channel. And I also have here a link for you for the Process Hayes and the introduction into mediation, moderation, and conditional process analysis, which is a really good basic reading or the start reading for you if you want to get your heads deeper into quantitative data analysis of experimental data. Now, you may be wondering, well, how do I actually prove that mediator 2 is actually an outcome of the mediator 1? Well, first, you try to build on very strong theoretical foundation when you do your research on consumers or with individuals, whichever area of social sciences you're in. And you use this theory to explain why that would be the case. Second one, and this is something that the journals would be really looking for, is the empirical proof. And in this case, for you to empirically prove it, that mediator 2 is the outcome of mediator 1, is to, by using Model 6 and Process Hayes or Smart PLS or any other tool which can model sequential mediation or path modeling, is to swap the order of your mediators. So what you do, you actually move mediator 2 here and mediator 1 here. And what you want in this case is actually this relationship to be not statistically significant to establish the presence of sequential mediation. So visually, it would look like this. You are putting your mediator 2 here, mediator 1 here, and this path here should not be statistically significant because you are using a different approach. Here is another example of a sequential mediation and experimental design. It comes from one of my works, which was published in the European Journal of Marketing. I was looking with my team at the end-use consumption, which is product reuse and upcycling, which applies to products which reach the end of their life cycle. And what we were looking at was the impact of different interventions. They were trying to understand which intervention would be more effective in creating greater end-use consumption. And we looked at creativity priming, environmental appeal, which mentioned the waste amount, the waste people generate, environmental appeal, where we showed them the examples of end use, what they could actually do with products that reach the end of their life cycle, and the control group, where we asked them to describe their typical day. The control group, again, allows you to understand what would be the outcome if nothing is present, no intervention is present. And in this case, in our first mediator, we actually hypothesized that creativity priming should be more effective in helping consumers come up with a greater number of end-use ideas and also in the quality of generated ideas. So the quality of the ideas should be better when consumers are primed to act creatively or to think creatively. And by the way, here we have given them a task to actually come up with end-use ideas for products. And then our next hypothesis to explain sequential mediation was that it would be actually the inspiration from this task from creating greater number of ideas and also more interesting, more creative ideas when we tap into the quality of the ideas that would actually encourage them to engage in end-use consumption. So in this case, you see that having the number of ideas and quality of generated ideas on its own cannot explain end-use consumption. There has to be naturally something else that would inspire consumers to engage in this behavior. And when we were conceptualizing this project, we thought that inspiration would actually describe this process in a bit more detail. So I hope these two examples that I use in this video help you to understand the instances when sequential mediation should be used. it is the consumer phenomena, consumer behavior, or individual phenomena where there naturally or logically should be several thought processes that consumers go to before something else is happening in terms of their dependent variable, in terms of attitudes, in terms of behavior. Now, you may be wondering, well, is triple sequential mediation possible? Can I have a third mediator in the experiment that I'm running? Likewise, you may be wondering, well, is multiple sequential mediation is possible where I have more than 3 mediators? Now, if you look at the statistical side of it, I would say using Model 6 from SPSS build on from Process Hayes, it is possible. And in fact, I randomly ran such a model for one of my experiments, and I threw 6 mediators in there, and it did work. But what I would say in this case is that you really have to have very, very, very strong theory, because it becomes too complicated, and very often the decision making process consumers go to is not that complex. And I haven't seen a paper which actually has more than 2 mediators in a model. If you find one, please let me know. Put it down below in comments. I would love to read it. But at this stage, given my own readership of the literature, I would hypothesize that it may be challenging to propose such an idea to a journal, and it may be challenging for you to convince your thesis examiners or the reviewers in the journal, and also think about the empirical assessment of the model for you to prove that this is really the sequential mediation that is taking place, because you will have to have multiple swaps, and it may get quantitatively a bit overcomplicated for you to examine this, because then you will need to have a series of those swaps, and you want to establish that it is really the sequence that exists, because if you swap the order, this relationship is not significant and the other one. Quantitatively, it may be challenging for you to do that, and too much work in terms of data analysis may be involved in there. Now, this is everything for the sequential mediation experimental design. Think about it as a domino effect. Once you expose consumers to your experimental mockups, it triggers mediator 1, and then it triggers mediator 2. Whether it triggers mediator 3 and 4, and so on, I'm not sure. If you find an academic paper that actually had such a design, put your comments down below. I would love to read this paper. But other than that, thank you so much for watching.